Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for having me here at NationJS. I'm here to talk about mixing with higher order components, RenderProps, and Mixins. These are all approaches to managing reusable logic in React, and I'd like to address each one and how it works. I'm on this little, I have no pockets, and I have this microphone that I'm maybe just it's gonna be my leash, and I can't get too far from the podium. So before we get started, I wanted to borrow a practice actually used in Australia and a few years ago back at Ruby Nation by Pat to do what's called an Acknowledgement of Country. I would like to acknowledge that this conference is being held on the traditional land of the NationJS people. I pay respect to elders past, present, and emerging of that people. Let us be aware that we occupy their homeland, that their presence is imbued in this land, these rivers, islands, and coastal plains. Now, by way of introduction, I'm Valerie Woolard Srinivasan. I'm a lead engineer on the publishing team at Panoply, which produces Megaphone, a software content management system for podcasters. I'm really, really glad and happy to talk about my favorite podcasts later on in the hallway if you catch me. But right now, we're talking about React. My team works in Rails and increasingly in React. My Twitter is also on the bottom here of every slide. Please feel free to tweet me your pictures of this presentation, favorite quotes, comments, or questions. I'll also be sharing some resources from this talk on that Twitter feed afterwards. You can follow me on Twitter. There are no warranties on that feed. So let's set the stage here. For starters, I've been to a few talks recently with these really amazing hand-drawn slides, and I thought that was really inspiring, but I also lack the artistic ability to illustrate my own slides. So my compromise is to use public domain children's book illustrations from the British Library. It's a low-budget option, but we work with our strengths. My strength happens to be finding weird things on the internet. So, once upon a time, there was a girl. Let's call her Mabel. Mabel worked for a widget company. The company sold all sorts of different widgets. Widgets with whirligigs, widgets with whatsits, widgets with whosits. Naturally, Mabel was a React developer for the widget company. As she thought about how to design their website, she knew there would have to be a page for each type of widget with a search function to filter through all those types of widgets. Perhaps each widget might be rendered slightly differently with different information on each page. That was all well and good. But the more Mabel thought about it, the more she realized that the logic for this search function would be more or less the same for every page, probably just differing in the URL that would be used to generate the search. And she didn't want to have to copy that logic into all her widget components. That would be tedious and redundant, in addition to the hassle that it would create if she ever wanted to change that search function in the future. She knows she had to do something. And lucky for her, there were several strategies she could use. She was not the first one to have this problem. It had been hashed and rehashed and optimized and stringified by many programmers before her. The React docs refer to these types of issues as cross-cutting concerns and offer several suggestions. Let's explore these possibilities, personified here by these elf-like creatures. How could Mabel add a search function without copying it into every component? She pondered this aloud for a moment. The first elf came forward. You should use a mixin, he said. What's a mixin? Mabel asked. It's a set of functions you can write and then include in components at your whim, he cackled. So mixins. Do you miss inheritance? This paradigm is probably most familiar to you if you've worked a bit with object-oriented programming and inheritance. Mixins in React can extend the class that they are imported into. Mixins can do pretty much anything you'd want your React component to be able to do. They can set state and hook into lifecycle methods. They extend the component they are included in, giving you access to the Mixins functions within that class. This gives you an easy way to define a set of reusable methods related to a given concern, and then include them in all the components you want. If you use lifecycle hooks in a Mixin, React will attempt to merge them with those of the extended component to make sure everything gets run properly. Here's an example of how you might include a Mixin. Let's say Mabel defined all of the functions she needed in this search Mixin file. It would be then required and included in the list of Mixins for every component where it would be used. That inclusion would give the component access to the functions and properties of the Mixin. All Mabel would need to do to get the functions to work is to include these two lines in any component that uses it. So at this point, Mabel's thinking, wonderful. That night, she returns home and begins to read more about Mixins. But it seems she was somewhat misled. While Mixins were once a recommended and supported way to handle things like this, it seems that is no longer the case. She runs across this post, Mixins considered harmful, which goes through all the things that can go badly or obfuscate your codebase when you use Mixins. Some of those are. In the case where you have two Mixins that define the same method, there are potential for naming clashes and unexpected behavior. The use of Mixins can obfuscate the logic in a component because it's not always clear where a function is coming from if it isn't actually defined in the base component or passed in through props. And probably most importantly, Mixins are no longer supported in components using ES6 syntax. OK. So Mabel is thinking, maybe this first elf didn't actually have the right solution. She's a little frustrated. She wonders aloud what she should do. The second elf pops up. You should use HOCs. Mabel, feeling a little wary now, asks, what's that, and how do I know I should listen to you? HOCs stand for higher order components, he said. They'll help you solve all your problems. So what's an HOC, or higher order component? So functional programming is cool now, right? HOCs are essentially functional programming in React. It's when functional programming allows you to compose functions by having functions take functions as arguments and return functions. Higher order components do that with components. So components are essentially functions in React. Instead of having a function that returns a function, higher order components can take a component as an argument and return a component. This can help you compose a component, which can then pass additional props or modify props to the component that is being passed. Higher order components are compositional and add logic or behavior to the components passed to them without adding user interface concerns. HOCs can be chained together to add multiple additional concerns, and they effectively transform a component into another component without modifying the input component or using inheritance. They work by manipulating or injecting props before sending them to the pass component. So here's some example code, sort of truncated for brevity. If you're looking for full fleshed out code of some of these higher order components, there are a good number of examples online. But let's say that Mabel has this higher order component with search. So it'll take another component as an argument, and from that, it might pluck out from the props some sort of search URL and use that to actually perform the search and return the props of the items that should actually be rendered in the component. You'll note that we're defining one function prop, handle search change, that will need to be called as a change listener on the search input of the past component. So we're adding these new props, and the rest of the props are then just forwarded to the underlying component as is. This can allow us, in some cases, to abstract away the state of the underlying component and let the higher order component handle the responsibility of managing state and sending the correct props. As always, there's some downfalls to this approach as well, though. Using more than one higher order component at once can get confusing. And as with Mixins, there's still some potential for naming collisions if more than one HOC is trying to modify the same prop or define the same method. Finally, the composition happens once at compile time, giving less opportunity to hook into the full React lifecycle. OK, so let's return to Mabel. She's feeling a little better now, but worried that these elves might still be holding out on her. OK, but is there anything else I should know? She inquired. There is one more thing. The third elf came forward. You could also use RenderProps, he said. Let's hear it, Mabel replied. All this is getting a little confusing, I know. Stick with me here. Let's take a quick break. Here's a little creature. It's kind of bug-eyed. I guess he's a dog. Maybe this could be Mabel's pet. Most of my talks, if you've been to any of them before, have a lot of animal GIFs in them. This one doesn't, because I was trying to keep with the whole storybook theme. So this is as close as we're going to get. Follow my Twitter for animal GIFs. Anyway, now that our palettes are cleansed, let's get back to RenderProps. RenderProps take a function that return a React element in their props. So for example, you can have a component that takes a render method as a prop and calls that to render rather than defining its own render method. One thing I like a lot about RenderProps is that they don't feel that different from standard React components. While higher order components are a whole new concepts to wrap your head around, these seem very much in line with things that you've probably written before. You've probably written a component that takes a function as one of its props. This is just sort of a different implementation of that. They tend to be less verbose, and they allow two components to share data, but let one handle the rendering. Here's an example of a very basic render method on a RenderProps component. As you can see, instead of having the UI defined here, the component calls the render method that has been passed into it with the component state. If Mabel were to use this pattern, she would probably define a handle search method in her render prop and pass the widget components as a render method. She could also, if she wanted to, just have the input field as part of this render prop component and then not have to worry about passing the listener back and forth. The drawbacks here are these aren't really composable in the same way that like a higher order component is. If you want to, say, share information between 4 different things instead of 2, it can get a lot more confusing. And because these generally inline the render prop components, there are some possible performance implications to that. But the consensus right now seems to be that in most cases, worrying about that is a premature optimization. Some wonky things can also happen if your should component update method doesn't respect children, so keep an eye out for that. There we have it. All 3 of the elves have spoken and said their piece. So I understand that all of this is a little overwhelming. As you do more research, you'll notice that lots of people have lots of feelings about how to use these patterns and which ones are best. When not to use RenderProps. I'm breaking up with higher order components. RenderProps, render callbacks, and higher order components are all interchangeable. Use a render prop. Function as child components are an anti-pattern. As with most programming topics, there are many strongly held and defended opinions. My desire is not to espouse any of these strong opinions necessarily, but to give you some information that will help you to inform your own development. So, after this overview, what have we learned? That's the rundown of the main approaches to this issue in modern React. Choosing between RenderProps and higher order components seems to me mostly a matter of preference and which one best suits your needs. Mixins should probably be avoided if at all possible. Some other concepts that came up as I was researching this talk that I didn't dig into here are decorators and container components. Decorators are a pattern that return a higher order component, and container components are wrappers around a rendering component that handle things like data fetching so that it doesn't have to be implemented in the same component that manages the UI. This is helpful for separation of concerns, but won't get around the reusability issue. Although writing container components could be a good first step in identifying shared logic that can then be factored down into one of these patterns. We talked about using these patterns in a search function, but that's just one example. Here are some other examples of situations in which these patterns could be helpful. Generally, it's helpful to abstract state management away from the rendering component as much as possible. So as you do that, identify places where you have similar logic in place across components. These could be mouse or scroll watchers, for example, for some sort of asynchronous loading or infinite scroll functionality. Subscriptions to an external data source. Submissions to an external resource, like a save button, for example. And in general, any UI-independent behavior. You should think about how these patterns could be used to make your code cleaner. One last thing. What about hooks? So in late October of this year at ReactConf, Dan Abramoff and Sophie Albert presented a proposal for hooks to be added to React. With hooks, you would be able to add watchers and setters to each aspect of state, among other things. So here, for example, you can see that useState returns both the current value of that state variable as well as a function with set to change that value. This makes it easier to modify states within a component. By the same token, there's this useEffect hook. This allows us to define an effect, like an API call that should be made when something else happens. In this example, we have a chat app that is subscribed to the online status of friends. And these code examples are all just from the React docs, like introducing hooks article. So you can feel free to dig into them there if that's something that interests you. You can also use these building blocks to make your own custom hooks. Here is the same code from the last slide rewritten as a custom hook. You can imagine Mabel rewriting use search results or something similar as a custom hook for her widget website. But we've got enough to worry about for now. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Hooks are currently an experimental proposal for React, so if you don't want to worry about them, that's fine. I think it's interesting to at least think about how they could make some of these things easier. That's all, folks. I snuck in one animal GIF. Thanks again for having me and for all of you for listening to me. Again, I'm Valerie Woolard Srinivasan. This is my email address. Feel free to also add me on GitHub or Twitter. I work at Panoply. We're looking right now for a product manager for our ad tech products. So if you know somebody or you are somebody who is interested in that opening, do feel free to chat with me later or send me a message on any of the above methods. We'll probably have some more openings posting soon in our engineering department. So feel free to reach out to me if you're interested in that. And that's all. Here are some resources that'll also be posted on my Twitter page. Probably much more useful then because you can't click links on this slide.